move along here. I'd like to welcome everybody to our cross-country safety share. Today, we're going to hear from Workplace Safety North, and I think Tom is doing the presentation on Lockout Tagout, which is a provincial initiative, and I think it is looking at using root cause analysis to improve lockout. We also have Chris Fowler from the Gorman Brothers group from their canoe operation that will talk about some of the steps that Gorman has been taking to improve their lockouts. So I'd like to introduce Tom from Workplace Safety North, and go ahead, Tom. Tammy's probably going to be making you presenter in a second or so. Okay, Tom, you should be able to get going.
Yeah, he's presenting.
Tammy, maybe I'll get you to call it up. I'm having some problems at this end. Thanks very much, Bill. We appreciate the opportunity once again to connect with a like industry in British Columbia, that we can share some of our projects that we're working on right now, and also share, allow you to share any feedback and learnings that you've identified from your end. What I'll be talking about today is a provincial initiative which Workplace Safety North and our industry partners through an advisory committee that we've developed for the specific initiative. Yeah, just back one slide, I guess, Tammy, if you can. Great. Okay, good. This is a provincial initiative that, and I'll give you the first few slides, will give you some background on where this came from, why we identified it as a priority, and why we were successful in getting some additional funding through our provincial provider to allow us to move ahead and do a deeper dive in lockout tagout related issues in the province and the forestry, paper printing and converting sector, and how we're moving ahead with that. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And similar to, I'm sure similar to yourselves, historically, we've always leaned on lagging indicators. And this was really where we started with the initiative through our Forestry, Paper Printing and Converting Advisory Committee, and identifying areas of concern that we wanted to focus on based on lagging indicators. And I pulled our most current infographic for the forestry, paper printing and converting sector infographic, which provides an overview of the overall injury statistics, which were captured by the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board for our forestry related sectors in 2021. And as you can see, about halfway down the page there, 33% of all lost time injuries in 2021 were associated with contact with objects and equipment, which is primarily associated with lockout tagout, either inadequate lockout tagout or ineffective lockout tagout procedures for the most part. So this is historically what we've seen year after year with the forestry sector, contact with objects and equipment being one of our primary areas of concern and where we're seeing the majority of our injuries happening. If you can go to the next slide, Tammy. So based on that background, oh, was there a question there? Sorry. Okay, based on that background, we move forward in doing a risk assessment specifically for the pulp and paper sector is where we started. And the pulp and paper sector, through their risk assessment, provincial risk assessment that was developed in conjunction with workers and employers or management representatives from the industry, identified these top 10 risks. And if we quickly scan through them, you can see 3 of these top 10 risks directly linked with inadequate or improper lockout of machines. Number 4, exposure to unguarded moving exposed parts on equipment during maintenance. And number 8, I believe it is, cut or crushed in equipment during operation, all relating to either inadequate or improper lockout. So it became a priority for our group. And the next slide, we did a bit of a deeper dive through a root cause analysis with the same industry representatives from workers and management to really flesh out what were the root causes of deficient lockout of machines. And these were the leading indicators that came out of that discussion. These were the top 10. There were more, but these were clearly the top 10 that came out of the discussion, including a lack of worker training and experience, improper lockout, lack of identification of equipment, lack of written procedures, inadequate lockout sheets outlining roles and responsibilities. And you can see a lot of these items, and we flesh these out a bit more during our discussions, are associated with aging infrastructure or aging operations. And pulp and paper mills in our province are a good example of that. Most are older mills, some 100 years and more in age. And in many cases, equipment has changed and changed regularly in a lot of situations. And the written procedures, the posted safe operating procedures, and documentation is not kept up with a lot of those changes. So that was a clear indication of some of the areas of concern that I've just gone through. Inconsistent lockouts, taking shortcuts, and that relates to the workplace culture and acceptable practices. Fatigue based on shift work and other issues came up as another factor that impacted. Mental health, again, tying in with fatigue, but having other factors like substance use in the workplace impacting. Vulnerable workers, as we're all experiencing right now, the pulp and paper sector, similar to many other sectors right now, are seeing a significant demographic change in the workplace, including some new Canadians or many young workers coming into the workplace. And that was one of the key items that was mentioned. In many cases, many of the operations identified that it was newer, younger workers in many cases that were training other new and younger workers coming into the workplace in relation to lockout. So there was some issues with inconsistency in lockout, and because of lack of experience, because they're new to the workplace, there were a number of identified issues associated with that. A history of no lockout in the workplace or poor workplace culture. And finally, interlocks were not set up appropriately. And again, this ties in with significant equipment change in many of the operations and upgrading. So this provided us a real clear background of not only the priority of the concern of lockout, tagout, some of the areas that were identified with industry that we needed to take a deeper dive on, and then the root causes that industry identified as priorities that we needed to take a closer look at, which I'll explain a bit more in the next slide. So the continuum that we follow through each of our risk assessment root cause analysis processes are to do the risk assessment, identify one of the key risks that we want to do a deeper dive on through the root cause analysis, flesh that out a bit more, and identify not only the root causes, but some potential controls. And eventually, once we get those controls in place, we want to measure or evaluate the effectiveness of those controls. In this case here, the control that was suggested was the development of an industry advisory committee to look at lockout in the workplace and come up with some solutions of how we can address these concerns and upgrade industry where appropriate to ensure consistency of lockout training and a higher level of lockout training and improve lockout in the workplace. Our next slide just provides a bit of an overview of the background that we were approved through our provincial initiative to move forward with. So this initiative is not just focusing on the pulp and paper sector. We're looking at all the resource sectors that WSN supports, and because lockout is a concern in all. Just to give you an idea, the corrugating sector in Ontario, lockout related issues was the #2 risk identified by industry. The sawmill sector, lockout related issues was the #3 risk. And for the logging sector, it was the #4 risk. So we're looking at not only just looking at one particular sector within the resource industry, but expanding this to all sectors through our process that I'll explain here in the next slide or two of how we're looking at moving forward for this. So what we're starting with here is providing a document to the industry to provide them a bit of background of why we're asking them to participate in the lockout assessment process. And it provides a bit of background on the root causes that I just went through on the earlier slide, and some of the recommendations that we're looking at of how we want to move ahead with this. And it's really broken into two segments. The first is a workplace assessment that will evaluate their lockout tagout program, the full spectrum of the lockout tagout program, right from the initial policy, procedures, SOPs, how effectively they're found within the workplace, the lockout related tools and equipment, are they available? Talking to workers and supervisors also in that operation to gauge the workplace culture as it relates to lockout tagout in the workplace. So it's going to be quite a broad assessment. And this is really the step that our advisory committee is at right now in developing what that assessment will look like. What we'll be doing and how we'll be using this document is we'll be sharing this information with our field staff internally within Workplace Safety North, and each of our field staff will be identifying 2 or 3 firms within their sectors that they cover, and offering to get those firms participating in this process with the initial workplace assessment. And the results of those workplace assessment will be shared with the firm, but they'll be compiled with all the results of assessments from across the province, and we'll build a train the trainer program from that point. This train the trainer will not be training them on here's the WSN lockout program that you should be following, because historically we did that 20 years ago and industry developed their own lockout programs, and it really was never used. What we'll be training them on is utilizing their internal lockout program and the assessment that was done in the workplace, building a train the trainer program to upgrade trainers consistently so that they can provide consistent lockout training, allowing the firm and the group that will be in the training to talk about key areas of concern that were identified during the workplace assessment, how they can be addressed, and then finally reviewing their lockout training program and providing a bit of a train the trainer to ensure that all trainers are up to a consistent high level to provide that training, and subsequently they'll be able to provide that training consistently in the workplace and at a high level that meets the requirements of the workplace and addresses a lot of the earlier concerns that were identified. So the next slide just talks a bit more about that. We'll be looking at our next steps at this stage. And as I mentioned, we're right at the stage of developing that workplace assessment that we want to utilize through our internal trainers. With a number of firms throughout the province in various resource sectors that we cover. And we'll be improving client understanding of lockout related on-site gaps using the workplace assessment tool, which I mentioned. We'll be looking at enhancing competency of on-site trainers by providing a train the trainer program addressing risks related content, as well as information on principles of adult learning and instructional techniques. And we'll also be improving client lockout program engagement, application, and improved workplace culture as we enhance the training and how that training will be applied in the workplace. And our subject matter expertise will allow for improving resource material and guidance to enhance WSN supports for our clients as we continue to move forward. As with the initial evaluations or workplace assessments, it will be just a handful of firms that will be involved. We want to be able to develop something that we can carry forward and make available to all our firms through the most effective process that's will come out of this overall assessment and recommendations from industry. That's a quick overview of where we are and how we're moving forward with this. It's quite an exciting initiative. And I know, and in speaking with Bill, you've done a lot of work in British Columbia in relation to lockout, tagout, and various ways of improving that in your workplaces. We're quite interested in hearing what you have to say. Also, if you have some information that would be beneficial for us that we could consider including as we move forward with our initiative, it would be beneficial as well. So with that, unless there's any questions, I'll turn it back to you, Bill.
Thanks, Tom. That's a great presentation, and I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of people on the West Coast here that will be interested in your assessment tool when you get it done, because that is something that we're kind of like delving into in terms of doing various assessments through our safety management systems. So anybody that'd like to ask a question of Tom for the presentation, put up your hand, or if nobody else is speaking, go ahead. Well, it looks like you did such a good job, Tom, that nobody's asking any questions.
Well, I always like that.
But for sure, we will be interested in an update in the future on how it's going, because it sounds very interesting.
Great, thank you.
So if there's no questions, I'd like to introduce Chris Fowler from Gorman's Brothers. Chris is going to talk about some of the work that they've taken to improve their lockout. We're on the West Coast, we're pretty knowledgeable about sort of some of the stuff they've done, but I think it's been very effective, and it's done a lot of good work for their operations. So go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Bill. Tammy, you are controlling the slides, correct? Perfect. Well, that's getting sorted out here. I just want to talk to you about how our lockouts tagout system here has been improved by addressing some of the concerns that we have with traditional lockout. So as Bill introduced, I'm Chris Fowler. I'm the safety coordinator with Canoe Forest Products. We manufacture plywood. I've been an employee for 9 years, so I've come up through the training of a new hire. I worked at a pizza place before this, and so I'm used to all sides of the industry where lockout isn't present, and then moving into the forest industry back in the early 2000s when lockout was really just starting to take off. Tammy, I'm on the next slide. I spent 2 years as a supervisor, and I've spent the last 7 years in safety working with David Murray, who also is on this call, developing and improving our lockout tagout system. We have 7 divisions located across BC and Washington State. So we are an international company, as most of the forest industries are these days. And so our rules kind of, they work in both BC and in the US and divisions there. All of our divisions that all of our divisions have gone through the improvements that I'm sharing with you guys today. So, I mean, everyone on this call knows what lockout and tagout is. And on the next slide, I just have a couple definitions, it's the de-energization and securing of equipment, so nothing bad really happens. it's a control measure so that we can deal with upset conditions and maintain equipment without getting injured. And how is it done in most places in BC is it's after they've been trained, employees are allowed to just stop it, lock it, and test it. And then they're allowed to enter the machinery, and then they get to work. And here at Canoe, we have a robust training system with very detailed training. We have a big document that we use to train employees about all aspects of it. We talk about, and our procedures are instead of task-based, they're area-based, so that you can migrate and you can go into different parts of a machinery and not have to worry about being exposed to live equipment. And so all of our divisions deal with all of this. On the next slide, we talk about the concerns that we have with lockout. Accountability is a big one. Is the lockout actually being completed properly? So we have procedures, we have documentation, we have training. We go through their annual file reviews and we train our employees every year. But what really happens when no one's looking? Are they testing it properly? Are they following the procedures? Are they even locking out? We have downtime pressures. We know that time is money, and we need a place to work in order to be safe at. So we've kind of adopted the rule we need to work safely. But safety isn't number one. Safety shares number one position with keeping the place running. So we all know that time is money. Employees are going to be rushing. There's pressure in this day and age to get the machinery up and running. When the machine is down, is information even being shared so that we can prevent the lockout from happening? Because every single time there's an upset condition, yes, we're not making money, but we're also exposing our employees to dangerous conditions. So are these reasons getting tracked? And do we know why there's even downtime? So that's the downtime bubble there that we've addressed. Honest mistakes. Sometimes people just make mistakes. They're rushing. Maybe like I said, maybe it's right near the end of the shift. Maybe it's right near their break. Maybe their supervisor's hounding them to keep the machine up and they're not doing a good job. Are they complacent? Are they tired? Do they have a bad sleep? Or even they frustrated? Are they frustrated because the machine's running poorly? And all of these things lead to just employees making an honest mistake. Not blatant mistakes, honest mistakes. There's concerns about injuries and making sure that the area is safe before they even get in there, because locking out is only half the battle. There's making sure that the work area that you're working in is safe. And doing a field level risk assessment as part of our program will identify some things in order to reduce that. And the last part of this concern with normal lockout is just the scope. A lot of places here in BC do task-based lockouts. So think about your kitchen, for example, and if you have to lock out your fridge, but you have direct access to your stove or your dishwasher or your microwave, are those all locked out too? Are they guarded sufficiently? So what we've adopted here is an area-based lockout. That isn't the point of this conversation and training, but one of the things we have going for us is that our area-based lockout allows us to lock out more so that people can migrate, and that reduces the risk. But not having a clear defined scope of where you're working, how you're getting in and out of the machinery is one of our concerns that we have with traditional lockout. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about a couple of the ways that we've solved these concerns. And this is the way, the industry has kind of tried to solve them. We've got training. Some companies really are very proud about their robust training. They spend an all day training their employee, making sure that they know the machine in and out, that they know all the names of the machinery that are all the parts of the machinery that they're with. And they go over it every year, and companies are relying on that. Double verification is something that's used where they have a peer or another worker that's near them, or a dedicated worker who they have to call, that comes and verifies their lockout or allows them to go in, but not recorded, not tracked. It's just I need a second set of eyes on that. Some companies are using technology with interlocked gates. There's a lot of new technology out there. Europe has come a long way where their rules are different, but they can rely on technology to make sure that employees aren't exposed to live machinery. We limit the lockouts. Some companies that I know here in BC and even in Washington, they only lock out, the machinery is only locked out with maintenance or even supervision employees. Regular employees, production employees aren't allowed to enter in lockout. And that's one of the ways companies reduce the risk of injuries is by just not having everyone go into them. There's lockout audits as supervisors or as management. We are supposed to observe that they are doing everything correctly, but how often is that actually happening, and are we getting a true scope of what's going on? And then there's avoidance. You can stick your head in the ground and just wait for the bad stuff to happen, which I don't think anyone is really doing these days, but kind of wanted to make you guys laugh a little bit. So our approach is we introduce one little step to the lock it or the stop it, lock it, test it model, and that's to verify. And when I say that, that means we have a dedicated person in our facility that goes to each lockout that occurs and verifies it. So simply, it's not a very hard thing to explain. You guys can all understand that you have a second person that comes in, but to verify brings up a lot of concerns where, what does that actually mean? And on the next slide, we talk about a little bit the definition about what verifying means, because they feel like as a supervisor, you are responsible for the training and well-being of an employee, but not all verifiers are supervisors. So we have to clearly define what verifying means. And that's just to make sure that the information that you're being told is done correctly. So if I'm a lockout verifier, I'm just going to talk to another employee who needs to enter a machinery. He's going to tell me what he needs to go. We ask a couple of questions, and I'm making sure the information he tells me is correct. Every lockout is observed. So what that really means is that every single lockout that we do here at Canoe Forest Products, at Downey Timber, at Selkirk, or every company division that we have in the Gorman Group is observed by a trained and authorized representative to ensure that the lockout is being done correctly. And it's really simple. On the next slide, I just kind of go over how the process happens. And it's very, very similar to double verification. It's just that we have a lot more tighter rules around it, where an employee has an upset condition, their machine plugs up, a machine breaks, insert anything that you guys have in your industries, and they call for a verifier. They get on the road, they get on the radio, and they say, I need a verifier to my machine center. While they're waiting for the verifier to arrive, they can still proceed with locking the machine out. They can stop it, they can lock it, and they're actually really encouraged to test it to identify any mistakes. The verifier and the employee, once the verifier arrives, the verifier and the employee just review the situation. They talk about where they're going to be entering the machine, what the task is that they have to do, any unseen hazards or maybe hazards that have presented themselves as a result of the upset condition. And they discuss that. The employee then switches off and shows the energy sources to the verifier. They reconduct a test start. It's really important that they do that. Here in BC, we have a rule that you have to push a button, you have to verify the lockout through test starts. And then as soon as that's been done and documented, the verifiers leave and the employee is allowed to start work. And so why do we need to do that? A few years ago, we had a volunteer shift at one of our divisions, a graveyard shift, for example, at the sawmill. For 1 month, they conducted lockouts, and they verified them by one single person. And in that 1 month, they had 480 lockouts. 100% obviously were observed because we don't know of any that weren't called to the supervisor's attention. And during those 480 lockouts, they've identified 32 mistakes, not necessarily lockout violations, but they identified mistakes, which could be using the wrong hand to throw the disconnect, using scissors when not required, things that are procedurally wrong. They didn't catch any lockout violations because no one was allowed to enter the machinery until it was verified. And they prevented 5 lockout violations, which means if they hadn't have been there, those 5 people, those 5 situations would have had employees exposed to live machinery. The year previous, so the 7,200 on the actual there is if you take the 480 for that shift or for that site and you extrapolate it out by all the shifts and all the workers and how many lockouts occurred. we extrapolated it that year to be 7,200 lockouts for that site. In the year previously, only 3% of those lockouts were actually observed through supervisors making random audits on their employees. And in that year previous, they only identified 7 mistakes in the whole year on all shifts at the sawmill. There was 4 violations that were caught and 0 of them were prevented. So those are staggering numbers, and they're kind of humbling at the same time and saying, hey, you know what, we're not perfect. We thought we had a really robust system. And look at this. Even though we only observed 3% of our lockouts, we identified 70 mistakes, and there was none of them were prevented. So moving that out, we would have over 500 mistakes that could potentially be identified, and we would not have any violations as a result of the lockout verification process. And we would prevent over 60 violations just based on the stats. And so that is what gave us the motivation to move into a full lockout verification program for all 7 divisions with 1,000 employees. Now, there's a lot of fears that come along with this from the management group, and they are real. And some of them haven't even gone away. There is a fear of increased downtime, waiting for a verifier to show up. Who knows where they are? How many verifiers do you have on shift? Here at Canoe, in our plywood manufacturing division, we have very limited number of verifiers because we are a union environment. We haven't gone to the next step of including verifiers from the union, so we keep it all in management. Some other places, they have employees, union employees doing their, or not non-union employees, but just employees doing the verifications, and they have 50 to 60 verifiers in their place. The point is that they just need a system to document it, and who is your verifier is less of a concern. But the increased downtime is a very big fear. And for companies these days watching our margins, we need to make sure that we reduce that. And if we're waiting for a verifier to show up, there is increased downtime. Putting these tasks on supervisors that are already doing more and more with more and more responsibilities on their shoulders and more reporting and paperwork and all that needs to happen, there is a big fear of overloading our supervisors. I kind of addressed it, who performs these verifications. It really could be anybody, but it has to be appointed by the company and trained. And it's like training a person for lockout and when they're first new to a company, but there's a little bit more involved to it. But the point of that is that who's actually going to do it? We don't have the resources to do it. Do we have to hire more people? And then lastly, what's the liability like? Like if there's a mistake, if a major injury happens, who's at fault? And then that's why in the previous slide we addressed what is actually a verification, and it's just verifying that the information we were told is correct. And so that's just our saving grace that we use to address that fear. Now the downsides of this are obviously reduced production, the lack of ownership, and these next 4 actually still occur today on our site, but we feel that they are less of a concern overall. But the lack of ownership, employees get a little bit of complacency around their lockout, and they say, oh, it's okay, if I make a mistake, the verifier is going to pop up and we're going to correct it. So they're not all even concerned about risking their lives when they enter a machinery. There are the downsides of people taking shortcuts if they're not following the procedures, and that falls directly on the shoulders of the verifiers getting complacent. And then the downside of the supervisor's time, because yes, it does increase the supervisor's time. So now moving to the upsides of it, because I did talk a lot of negative about it. Yes, in the initial, on the onset of the program, there was 2 machine centers in particular that were struggling. They would plug up with veneer from that was being fed into them, and our production took a huge hit as we were waiting for verifiers and waiting to enter the program or document the lockout into our system before they were allowed to go in like a permit. But that quickly changed as soon as management saw that there was an issue with that machine center. They focused on it, and in the next month we broke records on that machine center, and we haven't looked back. And that's been the same case everywhere. As soon as we got a machine center that's poking its head up, we're quickly able to knock it down by addressing it, because it's the downtime is more significant. We are able to identify trends and areas to focus on, as I just said. it gives management a little bit of peace of mind, knowing that there are mistakes that happen, that if we have someone else looking out for them, we can go home at the end of the night as management knowing that there's a second set of eyes and we are doing everything we can to reduce mistakes. Our supervisors are even more informed. Before, when you had a lockout, it wasn't always communicated because employees are just given the latitude to enter in a machine center and perform the work. But now our supervisors are being drawn to each machine center and they know in detail what's going on. And so it just makes it just identifies the mistakes so that we can increase productivity and also reduce the number of times we have to lock out and keeping our employees more safe. And as a result of that, we've had less injuries because people aren't entering them. And we're also doing field level risk assessments as we enter it, saying, hey, is there any slip, trips, and falls here? Is there sharp knives? Is there anything that's above you that could fall down? And we secure that all prior to entering. We've reduced the number of lockout violations from 6 to 7 a year to, I'm going to be honest, down to 3. And I'll get to that in the next slide. We're sitting about 3 on average a year. And that may sound stupid. Actually, I'll just address it now. The lockout violations we get would have still happened regardless. They are just not accidental lockout violations. These ones are blatant where people don't even attempt to lock out or they're not trying to do the right thing. They're just entering the machinery to take shortcuts. So we have reduced our lockout violations, but there's nothing really that can prevent it unless you go to a full automated lockout guarding gate system. Like Bill was involved in a great video that's on YouTube there with cooperation from WorkSafe that shows that in great detail, but those are very costly. The upside of verification is that this employee is entering in the area. They're going into a specific area. It's a contract, it's a permit, and you've identified all machinery that they can enter. Honest mistakes are identified and they're corrected. So if I'm going up to do a lockout and I'm the second set of eyes and I see that there's a mistake, maybe they didn't run a cable through a disconnect, or maybe they just misread a disconnect and they locked out a hydraulic cooling fan versus the hydraulic pump, then we correct that. And that doesn't happen when you don't have a verifier. And also we have a leading indicator we use this as a leading indicator of its effectiveness, knowing that how many mistakes happen, and we know that mistakes happen even without the verification process through that test we did on the graveyard shift at a sawmill. We know that mistakes happen. So we use this as a positive, and we encourage people to report them, and we make the process as easy as possible without having any big paperwork or reports that they have to fill out. Just a little bit of information so we can track it. The next slide shows a little bit of a graph of our current year. I'm showing my dirty laundry here. Oh, hold on a second. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. Sorry about that. So corrected lockouts are the mistakes that are found during the verification process. And these are what we use as a leading indicator. As Tom mentioned, lagging indicators don't really help us get better. But we use these corrected lockouts as a leading indicator. So when a mistake is found during the verification process, we praise it. We encourage people to report them and to identify the mistakes so we can correct them. They are rare. Corrected lockouts occur here at my site about 1 in every 300 lockouts, and that's not very much. You might say, well, that's a lot. That's not a lot of it's not a lot of mistakes happening, and we're happy with that. But this year we've had 18 corrected lockouts that have resulted in 72 employees being exposed that could have been exposed to live machinery. And I don't think anyone is comfortable with having one employee exposed to live machinery. But when you're 99.75% accurate, like we are, mistakes still happen and they could have big consequences. So we aren't, as I said in the last slide, we're not perfect. We still get the odd violation, but they're blatant. They're people that are just not going to lock out anyways. And we're lucky enough to catch them. And so we've had 3 of those this year. So 1 of those this year, but on average, we're having 3 a year. The next slide. as I've kind of talked to the stats already, and this is just a lookout of how my summary looks. I track the date, a very brief description of what happened, the number of employees that were involved, the location where it happened, so that we can try to identify any trends. EID is just I use as an acronym for energy isolating device. Was it a misread of that device? Did they lock out the hydraulics cooling fan versus the hydraulics pump? And this is just what I do to track it and try to reduce it. And we have reduced the number of corrected lockouts. The first year we had it, I had 72 at my site, 72 corrected lockouts, and we're sitting at 17 this year. And they are good metrics to reach for and track. The last slide is just a summary. At our facility, we require our verifiers to review and record every single lockout that happens. We've been running this program for 5 years, and despite the fears of decreased productivity and increased downtime, we've actually done the opposite. We've increased productivity and reduced downtime. We've also reduced the number of lockout violations. We've also reduced the number of corrected lockouts and mistakes that are happening through ongoing training. And more importantly, we've reduced the number of injuries. And that's all I got. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks a lot, Chris. That was an excellent presentation, and it's something that I've experienced in many of the operations in BC, and it really appears to be something that is effective and works. So way to go. Thanks for the plug on a project that we did. It was a project on control system isolating devices, which attempts to remove the human factors on a certain number of lockouts on a piece of equipment. So you can watch the video, and if you're interested, you can get more information. Just send us a note. So are there any questions from Chris? Because he presented a lot of good data there.
Yeah, I've got a question for Chris. If you can hear me, Chris. What happens if you get a situation where you got the person doing the lockout and you get a verifier who comes and then they disagree what the correct lockout is? Do you have the procedures posted somewhere or the easy access to it? Or how do you work through that scenario?
Yeah, Travis, that's a very, I'm gonna expand on that in a little bit, but I'll address your first question. Every single lockout required by WorkSafe here in BC requires us, every machine center requires a specific procedure available to the employees that's posted, so that they can follow the procedures. So this actually happens quite a bit, especially in the maintenance department, especially with new millwrights that come from places without a robust system. They disagree about it all the time. And all the verifier has to do is say, hey, look, man, I didn't make the rule, Fowler did, and we just follow the procedures. And if they don't agree with that, they're not allowed into it. And if they continue to disagree with it, we call that insubordination, and eventually it's dealt with by their direct supervisor. And hopefully it never gets to the point of discipline, but we've had it once where someone just completely wanted to prove their point that they didn't need to do something. But the fact of the matter is we have robust procedures that are easy to read, and they are a little bit overkill, but everyone is safe no matter what situation you're doing, because rather than a task-based lockout, as I was mentioning, we have an area. So instead of locking up my fridge in my kitchen, I'm locking up my entire kitchen, because let's face it, in this example, the whole kitchen will be down while I'm servicing the fridge. And it's so easy just to say, yeah, everything's locked out in this area, and therefore just follow the rules.
So
we have had.
Sorry.
No, go for it, Travis.
Are they posted? Because I was a WorkSafe officer and had looked for that in smaller businesses, and then when I've come to work at sawmills and I've tried to push that idea, you realize the complexity of the variety of lockouts that could happen at a machine center, between a jam up compared to maintenance, compared to what's upstream or downstream of that process, and the chaos it might cause. Now, not having hands-on experience necessarily with working with those machines, I didn't come up through the ranks. I believe what I'm told. So a lot of the time I'm working through an idea of a matrix up, and some of our mills have them, and they've got these awesome rulers that sort of you can slide up and down. We have mills that actually have machine sensors that are colored, and then the MCCs are colored and the lockouts colored accordingly. Other places, it's kind of a bit of, what do they call it? Tribal knowledge, which was very scary to hear.
It is, Travis.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and that is a real concern. Luckily enough, Bill's been through my place. David Murray has as well. He's on this call. My facility and all plywood facilities are little tiny machine centers compared to sawmills, where they start in one location and they end in another. And so isolating the energy on our machine centers is very easy compared to the pulp and paper industry, to my knowledge, and definitely to lumber mills. And one of the things I was mentioning is that we have area-based lockouts. So if I can go into an area and I can touch anything in it, that has to be locked out. And there are certain areas where it's just not feasible to put a guard. It's not feasible to lock out machinery, but then we define it by putting red lines or yellow lines on equipment, whatever your company wants, and identifying boundaries that they have to stay in if they want to lock out that area. And if they travel outside of that scope, then their lockout has to change. And it made it really easy for the verifiers to say, hey, I'm going into, instead of having, well, sorry, I'll back up a little bit there, Travis. Rather than having 15 different procedures that you can have with those matrices, like, do I need to change this knife, or is it the upper knife or the lower knife? Or do I have to change this belt? We just say, if you're going into this area, it's all locked out. Now, I can appreciate, because we have 2 sawmills in our company that are struggling with the exact same thing you are, is just about defining those boundaries and coming up with a procedure that you can follow. It can be very difficult, Travis. I can appreciate that for sure.
I got one more question.
Yeah, you bet.
What is the documentation process like? How onerous is that?
Yeah, so we have a digital safety program online that allows us to use mobile devices, and during that we make an observation. So our verifiers, they log into this app and they record it as an inspection, actually, with a list of questions. And I'm happy to forward you those questions, but they're really basic. Like, is the air locked out? Is the hydraulics locked out? Has the air been locked out or tested? Has the scope been identified? And all of these are just there's 10 basic questions that have to be asked for normal lockouts. But if we have like a big jam up in our lathe and there's log debris everywhere, or if we had a dryer plug up and there's lots of water on the floor, the supervisor has a second set of questions that they can use as a field level risk assessment to identify hazards in the area and show that their accountability towards making the area safe prior to entry. So it's just, I'm not going to talk about what program I use. If you're interested, Travis, we'll get in touch. But there are many different programs out there. But we did start with a paper-based form where we had a bunch of little papers that we kept, and we filled them all out. We had the employees sign them as kind of like an agreement. We've moved away from that because it didn't really work in our place. It took a lot of time, and we're trying to streamline the process as fast as we can to find the happy balance between being 100% perfect and being 0% right. And documenting on paper took a little bit too long, and it didn't have any benefit to us to do that. So we moved to our stuff digitally. And the added bonus to that is we were able to track how many lockouts we have a year and how many mistakes we have in a year. And it gave us a little bit of metrics rather than having to sort through on paper. So we just document them through an online safety program.
Yeah, we're going to be working on that. So I'd really appreciate those questions so that I can add that to the team as part of the process for the digital side. And I really also appreciate the idea that by monitoring lockouts, you determine that certain machine centers or areas actually had problems that management then listened to and spent more time, effort, and money on in correcting. It's always the first question I ask when we do have a lockout violation in the team calls that we might have, is how often are we having to lock out you? Because I can imagine if I had to lock out 40 times in one shift, I'd be skipping steps too. I think we're all human, we'd all find that skipping. So that, why is there someone not speaking up saying this thing's jamming up non-stop, or why we're not finding that? Because you might have operators who are really quick with lockouts, so you don't notice the downtime. But now that you monitor it, you're going to say, well, there is actually a downtime. So yep, appreciate that part. Certainly as a selling point for verifiers, because I'm really wanting that to be part of our process. So,
yeah, thanks for your time, Charles. And one of the things that actually worked well for us is that because there was the tremendous amount of downtime before, we we acted on it fast. If employees get frustrated by having to deal with it, with not closing the loop, on what I mean that is, they know that there's an issue. The supervisor has told them that, hey, we're going to deal with it, but doesn't follow back with them and say, hey, this is the timeline, and stay in constant communication. That's where employees get frustrated, and they start turning negative towards the system and towards the machine center. But if you keep the lines of communication open and tell them, the timeline that they're going to have to deal with this for, it worked out really well for us. We have also screwed that up, Travis, and had things fall through the cracks, and we had employees get very frustrated with us. We're also very fortunate that we have a program that monitors our machine uptime for us automatically, and identifies we have clear defined timelines. When a machine center is down, it records it. And sorry, Travis or Trevor, you're talking. It's kind of loud in my ears here. Sorry, buddy. But yeah, we have a digital tracking system, and I think a lot of places in BC even have this, where every single time a specific motor is turned off, we have a server that keeps track of that. So that, in combination with increasing the amount of downtime, it kind of exaggerates the point, but it puts focus on the maintenance team to address them really quickly.
Thank you.
Travis, I'm just really curious about, did you have to hire someone full-time to be a verifier? How do you manage that if you're running 3 shifts, 24/7? I know for us, we have, for machine centers, it's easy. Post your matrix, have your clear lockout training, all that. For all the troubleshooting that occurs, did you guys, every time you came across a new problem, create a new procedure? Or did you just do a hazard assessment before and then have it verified? I couldn't even imagine the amount of time it would take to have someone just, that's all they do. Or they would be so busy, they'd be running around from operation to operation, depending on the size, verifying. Really curious around how you freed up time for that.
Yeah, you bet, Trevor. And so that, in our division, was an easier pill to swallow than it is in a lumber mill. For us, it was also it was easier and also way more difficult. I know that didn't sound right, but we have 2 supervisors on this shift, one that takes care of our green veneer and one that takes care of our dry veneer, or the log side of our plywood facility, and then the finishing side. And those supervisors, they verify every single lockout on every shift. So we run 24 hours a day, 6 days a week roughly. And every supervisor is a verifier here on our site. And there are days where they're running ragged. But those days, that just addresses the point that, hey, this place isn't running very well, and maintenance needs to get on board and start fixing things. And that does happen. In one of our sister locations, they have their site is spread apart in multiple buildings. Like, we have a huge facility and everything is really under one roof here. In our West Kelowna plant, everything is spread out in different buildings, probably across 3 or 4 different buildings over maybe a kilometer, maybe 2 kilometers. It's hard to say how big their site is. And they've gone an approach of almost like the buddy lockout system, where their peers can help lock them out, as well as the supervisors and as well as the lead hands. They have dedicated people that have earned the responsibility to be verifiers, and they have a reputation and they have the integrity to do the job correctly. And those machine centers, the key to it, Trevor, also is that we don't have a lot of downtime. It's not like we're targeting 80% or we're targeting 90 to 95% uptime on all of our machine centers. So there really shouldn't be that much downtime associated with them in our place. And this is why it worked for us. We did not go out specifically and hire anyone. We probably will add shifting, or we are looking at modifying it where we're running, instead of 2 supervisors only, running 2 supervisors and a lead hand. at all times and all shifts. So that is one thing that we are working towards to reduce the amount that our supervisors are doing.
Go ahead, David.
Just to add to what Chris has said, so to be clear, we don't have separated employees designated for just carrying out lockout verifications. They start with somebody in a leadership role. Supervisor is the right call at the beginning, and depending on the situation, Chris has alluded to the fact that in unionized operations, this is viewed as a supervisory activity, and so it's a little bit more problematic to have unionized employees carry out the verification process. It does happen though in Chris's plant. There are millwrights and other trades workers that will be given the authority and the training to be able to carry out a lockout verification. As far as really understanding the process, the safe work procedures, the lockout procedures are already pre-identified with each of these machine centers. So they're posted in a variety of different ways. Like one of the previous people on the call had described, there's multiple different ways of sharing how the lockout procedures is prior to entry. And at your plant, Chris, I think it is kind of it's area based, and it is some sort of a matrix, correct?
Yes, that's correct. We have a matrix. I'm trying to rework our procedures as our workforce tends to get a little bit older. There's more and more prescription glasses on the floor, and I'm trying to make them easier to read for those individuals. And because getting away from the matrices, they are hard to read, and that we identified that early on as one of the sources of mistakes.
Okay, any more questions for Chris? So Chris, I just want to say great presentation, and I'm pretty sure that you're open for further questions or support if anybody contacts you, but we'll also be sending out the presentations to everybody. Also, if anybody wants to send me a note, I can help send them in the right direction. There are various different ways operations have put together their verifiers. Some are just supervisors, some are qualified persons within their organization. Some use tradespeople. So it's quite a varied way of doing it, and really all of them work in one way or another. So please don't think that you can only use supervisors to do verifications. You know, there are other options out there. So any other questions for the presentations that were sent out today? So like Tom or Chris's presentation?
No, that was good. Thank you guys for sharing.
Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for participating. This was a great discussion we had, and I think some really good insights. Okay, Travis, thanks for your clapping there. I thought it was another question from Travis because he's always wanting to dig more. And it looks like Ed Kent, you have a question before we finish off. Go ahead, Ed.
Maybe he was just high-fiving Bill.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Thanks very much, Bill. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.